everyone, and welcome to Capes, Cows and Masks, the show where we uncover the world of soups and science fiction. I'm your host, Jake Hart. I'm a podcaster and a writer for Fresh Take Hub, and as always, I'm joined by my fellow co-host.
Hello, I'm David Oscar. I am a writer and editor over on freshtakehub.com, and general nerd.
We're all general nerds here on the show.
No, I'm general nerd. There's an army. There's an army. There's a commander nerd, but that's Tom.
There's a ranking. Yeah, he's the shogun at the top. Yeah, today's show is actually very special because we're going to be reviewing a film that we should have seen 14 months ago. And after 11 years since her introduction to the MCU and several delays later, Black Widow has finally hit our cinema screens and our TV screens on Disney+. So we're going to be giving our spoiler review, what we liked, what we didn't like, and all that good stuff. Dave and I are not doing this on our own. We do have a special guest joining us. She is also a writer on the Fresh Take Hub and an animation, film, and musicals expert. Please welcome to the show, Kelly Bishop. How you doing, Kelly?
I'm good, thank you. How are you?
All good. Very good over here. We're so glad we could get you on the show. We thought, because Dave and I cannot speak about this film from our perspective, we do need a female perspective from this, considering this is, it's been a long time coming, this film. Fans have been asking for this film for a while. Even though we did have Captain Marvel as the first female solo outing for the MCU, everyone's been sort of saying, how come Black Widow hasn't got a movie yet? So it's been a long time coming. So we're very happy you could be on the show to give us your perspective and point of view, because there's definitely things that Dave and I cannot relate to. But before we get into the actual film itself, Kelly, I want to start with, we're going to talk about our sort of the cinema experience first. So, it's been 2 years since we've seen the MCU in the cinema. And, for me, even though cinemas have been reopened for a few weeks now, a couple of months now, for me, seeing the MCU back in the cinema was like, yes, cinema is actually back now, because it's the big thing for me going every year to see the MCU film. So what was your cinematic experience like with going to see Black Widow?
Yeah, I think I've seen a lot of the MCU in cinema, and I remember seeing it on Disney Plus that morning and thinking, I could just watch it from my sofa, but it wouldn't feel right. And we'll talk a bit later about some of those action sequences and some of those really core elements of the film, which I feel like I'd be cheated by myself if I watched it from home. So actually going to the cinema to see it, having that connection with the people in the same room as you after being so solo watching films for so long, it's just nice to be back in that sort of comforted hold of a dark room with a big old screen.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I was fortunate enough to go see it twice. Saw it once in a normal screening, and then me and Dave and our friend also on the show, Tom Gapper, we finally reunited after months apart to go see this on the big screen in IMAX. And if people can, I highly recommend to go see the film in IMAX. Just adds that extra level of the cinematic experience. But Dave, I know what your second trip was like because I was there. But what was your first trip like? Obviously, seeing it for the first time.
Yeah, well, I think I said to you as well on the second trip, it was interesting because that day Loki had come out as well. So I'd watched it the same day as Loki. So if it was any other sort of MCU show, you probably could have seen quite a drastic change between television quality and film quality. But because that was probably one of the most cinematic and high budget pieces of television that we've had from any of the MCU shows, I would probably argue for that last episode of Loki, then it was quite rivaled in that sense in terms of the actual engagement, how clever that story was. That episode of Loki was so tight and so well told. To then have something, in which you don't know what's going to happen next. It's interesting then to go to a story in which you're like, oh, this is set between two films you've already seen, which are both set in the past, which are both in the past at this stage. This is kind of squeezed in between those two. But undeniably, you can just tell straight away that the kind of things like car chases and, big escape sequences and big sort of battles in the sky and all that kind of stuff, that's the kind of stuff you wouldn't get in Disney Plus. I don't think you'd ever see, maybe to a degree, but you wouldn't see the level of like stunt work and practical effects and visual effects. So I think that seeing it the first time, obviously you could tell that level of quality in terms of the cinematography, the action, the directing even as well. Whereas the IMAX experience definitely enhanced all of that as well. Like the action scenes, etc., really made it clear that, like, look, this is what you get when you go to the cinema and see a Marvel film. This is what you don't get in an MCU show.
Yeah, I wholeheartedly agree. I feel as if you would just, like, because we've been living with the MCU now on the small screen since January, since WandaVision came out. And, you know, it's fed us, you know, enough while we've been starving of MCU, and all the shows have been really good. And, you know, we were all excited to see the fanfare opening and stuff like that. But there was something about when you first see the fanfare opening on the big screen, the loud music and everything. It's just a completely different experience. And as well, I have to say, like, it was probably that screening I went to on opening night. It was probably I have never been surrounded by more people since pre-pandemic. Like, that's the most people I've seen in one place since, or I've entered into one place anyway. So there was a certain element of like, okay, I feel as if we're coming back to normal now. The MCU's back. There's a lot of people here. It's creating that buzz. So yeah, it was a weird experience for me. There was still that sense of like caution of like, oh, what you know, there's a lot of people here and stuff like that. But there was also, it was mixed with that excitement and adrenaline of seeing the MCU back on the big screen. And like you said, Dave, yeah, seeing those big action sequences, the car chases and stuff, that's got to be seen on the biggest screen possible, because it just adds that extra layer of the experience, which, you know, unfortunately Disney Plus doesn't quite do. So yeah, let's get into the film itself then. So Kelly, what are your overall thoughts going into this film, and were you a fan of the character within the MCU?
So when I first came into the MCU, I was a couple of films late, I'll admit that, and meeting all those characters, Black Widow was never the one that I loved the most. I'm a big Captain America fan, I'll say that outright, but Black Widow was always one of those where I was like, she's really cool, but I don't know enough about her. I can take that off the table now, and I love her. I love everything about her, and now I don't have her anymore, and I don't know what I'm doing, because I'm just like, we were given all of this stuff about her character, all this really cool backstory, these really interesting family elements, which I'm sure we'll talk about later, which would have made what happened to her in the later films of that sort of phase 3 so much more impactful, because now I love her and I can go back and I can watch those films again and be like, oh my god, like, that's Yelena's jacket, which I think is one of my favorite little moments. But we'll get on to how much I love Yelena later. There's no way of you guys escaping that. But I think it's given me so much more love for this character.
Yeah, that's a really good point. I've seen a lot of people actually bring that up, that they've loved what this brought to the table for Natasha, and then they're like, but there's no more. Like, it's like, what do we do now? But Dave, what are your sort of overall thoughts? And were you a fan of Black Widow and Natasha Romanoff going through the MCU?
Yeah, I was definitely a fan. I think that she always managed to make it so that when you thought of, obviously a lot of people will think of like Thor, Cap, and Iron Man. And I did feel that it was Thor, Cap, Iron Man, Black Widow. I felt that she was one of the core essential members. I think that she did a really good job in sort of easing us into that kind of team mentality. So like Winter Soldier, which was probably one of the first times we had a MCU film, which was kind of like, okay, we're going to start like using other characters now, and it's not always going to be about this one character, you know, this contained world, like just the Iron Man characters, just the Thor characters. Black Widow coming into that film was a good example of how they could sort of start to cross over, and I think that she did like a fantastic job in that film. I really enjoyed like her arc throughout Endgame. I thought that they did a really good job with that. So like Kelly said, I think that this film obviously adds to that, but for me personally, I still felt quite invested by that arc just on its own. Yeah, I felt going in that, you know, she was fully deserving of a film. I think that it's a good way of sort of introducing another kind of world or band of characters. And it's interesting to think of whether we would have, if we had a film, say, 10 years ago or something like that, whether it would have worked. I've said, we recently did an episode about female Marvel heroes on Well Good Movies, and I was saying about, the unfortunate thing with Black Widow is that she always was a side character, even from her days in the comics. You never really had, like Iron Man. She started as a, antagonist to Iron Man, and then she became part of the Avengers. So it was never like Black Widow, the comic, was like the first introduction to the character. So it's always hard for her to sort of shake those reins, whereas Captain Marvel was always kind of like her own thing once she transitioned from Ms. Marvel. So I guess in a way this film kind of does reflect the world and the changes we've had in the past few years of, wasn't the right time for these kind of female-led stories 10, 15 years ago. Now it is the right time for these kind of stories, and this is where this character can flourish, whereas maybe before it kind of would have just seemed a bit hokey, or it would have just been a bit of a meh kind of MCU movie, kind of like an Incredible Hulk kind of thing. As much as I would love to see a kind of like proper spy espionage film, I think making it when they did now, I think my overall thoughts of the film was like, yeah, that's a fantastic, great MCU film, but I don't think there's much else way they could go with it, to be honest, because if you're going to place a film in between two other massive, huge MCU films and the character has, spoiler, already died, it doesn't give you much dramatic, ways to go about it. It's not, some people I've seen have called it a lukewarm finale, but it's like, well, in some ways it has to be, because she doesn't die in this film. And if they had done a full origin story, it's a bit too late for that. We've seen, like so much of her. I don't really think that you can kind of, with Doctor Strange or Captain Marvel, yes, they're introducing a new character, but with Black Widow, you can't be like, oh, after seeing everything now let's go find out how she became who she was. And it's a bit like, 5-6 films later, I don't know if you can really tell a prequel at that stage. So I think it did its job. I think it's a really enjoyable film, got some fantastic elements in it. But my main problems, as we'll get on to, is probably with like the villains and that kind of stuff. But like Kelly, I love Yelena, etc.
Yes. We I think we're all gonna love Yelena in this review.
We're on that Florence Pugh train.
Forever on the Florence Pugh train.
I thoroughly enjoyed this film. I thought, like I said at top, it's an incredible experience to watch this on the big screen, especially in IMAX. Like, I think the visuals are stunning, the acting is top notch. I enjoyed the story enough. I have, similar questions like you, Dave, about, the placing of this film and what you could have done with this film post her death, considering we already sort of see her story. But are some beats familiar? Yes, and I also feel there's a lot of these types of tropes and cliches that we've seen in the MCU a lot before, particularly in The Winter Soldier. Yes, there's a lot of that. But I do think the director, Kate Shortland, and the writers, they found new and inventive ways, of using these tropes of espionage and female assassins and all the other spy stuff we're familiar with. But I think what elevates it above a typical spy film, or even like some of the other Marvel films, is the performances from all the cast. I just think it elevates that to another level that I go, okay, I can see what you're doing here, so I can get past some of the cliches and some of the tropes. But like you, Dave, I think a lot of my main issues comes with the villains and how the villains were utilized. But everything else, I think, was really well done. It's another sort of good addition to the MCU. Going to, the question about whether this film should have come out or not at a different time. And I think rightly so, people are right that it should have come 5 or 10 years ago. Would it have fallen into some of those traps that usually happen with some female superheroes? Possibly, but that shouldn't, in my opinion, it shouldn't even be a discussion. It should have just come out when it should have come out and been a good film. Do you know what I mean? But unfortunately, that's not the world we live in. I just feel as if a lot of things needed to happen in our society and within the film industry for this film to turn out as good as it did. Like, recently, Scarlett Johansson spoke about Black Widow's introduction to the MCU in Iron Man 2 and how the character was very sexualized, and she wasn't a fan of that. We've now moved past that, or I should say, we're trying to move past that. Post the Me Too movement, and create more fleshed out approaches to these female characters with their own agency and not having to rely on male character storylines. And I just think all of that needed to happen to get this film as good as it was. Do you know what I mean? I don't feel as if, had it come out 5 or 10 years ago, it wouldn't have been as good, I don't think. And I also say to people, we wouldn't have gotten Florence Pugh had it come out that long ago.
Yeah, I think Scarlett Johansson has said herself that the Me Too movement was a massive part, again, this film made as well. So again, you know, you couldn't have done that 10 years ago. But also, yeah, the fact that when you look at how tight the storyline is for the MCU and Kevin Feige's plan, you could tell that maybe like just some random spy espionage story just wouldn't have fitted into that either. So I think that, you know, it's a difficult one and you can kind of understand it. I suppose the biggest thing is probably we should have had a female-led superhero film a lot earlier. Whether that was Black Widow and anybody else, we just should have had a female-led superhero film earlier. You know, as to who that was, up to Marvel to decide that. But so I think that that's the biggest thing. But like you said, the good thing is now, yeah, give us a Black Widow film with, you know, Yelena or something. That'd be great.
Yeah, Kelly, what are your thoughts on this? You know, you being the female out of us three.
Yeah, I think generally, like my first impression when I like came out of the film, I turned to my partner who I went with, and I did the whole Joe from Little Women, just women. There are so many incredible female performances in this film. Kate Shortland as the director as well. I think this film could have turned out so differently if it landed in the lap of a male director. We could have ended up with those really over-sexualized performances again. We could have ended up with an incredibly different script. All of these things have really like been pieced together by small steps in the right direction by these big studios. In relation to the Me Too movement, like there's still work to be done. Like we've had 2 white female superheroes. Can we have Monica Rambeau in the forefront of another? That would be great. But we're making steps in the right direction. And I think this film, like when I saw it, there were so many young women in that audience watching that film and being empowered by film. And I think that's the most important bit to take away. Like, we've got female superheroes. Let's use them. Let's empower women to have a voice.
You had to come to Budapest, didn't you?
I came here because I thought you wouldn't. But since you're here, what bullet does that?
Not bullets, arrows.
Ah, right.
If you didn't think I'd come here, why'd you send me this?
You brought it back here?
I'm not here trying to be your friend, but you need to tell me what that is.
It's a synthetic gas, the counteragent to chemical subjugation. The gas immunizes the brain's neural pathways from external manipulation.
Maybe in English next time?
Это антидот контролю сеназ.
So let's go into like the sort of the story and the plot and some of the themes as well. So I'll go back to you, Kelly. What did you think of the storyline that they presented, and was there any particular themes that spoke to you?
It gets really heavy when we think about themes in this film. Like, you start with the lighter ones of like family and found family, this struggle that Natasha's got between the two. She wants to be loyal to the Avengers, but then there's this family that she's got on the other side. But then there's the really dark undercurrent about trafficking that is quite intense, with Natasha and her sister Yelena being sold practically to the Red Room to become assassins. And like chemically trained assassins. Like, it's incredible. I think you're right in that some tropes do prey on this film a little bit. Typically along the lines of, this whole thing wasn't real, well, it was real to me. That's a very common one when we talk about like family dramas. But overall, I think the story holds up pretty well. Some of the villains, a little bit weak in places. There are definite moments where I was like, oh, that could have been slightly different. But I think overall the story of Natasha having family in 2 places, when throughout her entire sort of MCU arc, we found her being like, I don't fit in, I do fit in, I don't, I do, that kind of bouncing between. She's always felt like she fits, but then she feels like an outsider as well. It's an interesting dichotomy in her own head that we're sort of seeing the origin of here.
Yeah, I suppose that aspect is interesting to me because, again, because the way that the character's always been played, and that's an enjoyable element of hers, that she wasn't the kind of, brash, loudmouthed character. Like she's very much a kind of like, shy to a certain extent, or just sort of like competent or like, informative kind of character. She's not like a kind of Star-Lord or anything like that, or, Tony Stark and this big sort of brash character. So to make that person the kind of more main character, especially somebody who kind of like, as a spy, I suppose, sits back, listens to the situation, is kind of more serious, is a bit more sarcastic. It's kind of interesting giving them their own arc because, like Kelly said, it means that they're going to have like issues and things that they're dealing with in their head, but they're not necessarily going to be like massively vocal about. And I think that that's something that's interesting about these newer MCU films, where they tend to be like, right, it always needs to be a team of characters, and you've gone away from the days of Iron Man, in which it was tended to be like all the supporting characters were supporting in the sense that they weren't super powered, they were all just kind of like normal people. Whereas now it's kind of like, you look at something like Black Panther, and most of his surrounding characters are all like warriors of some kind, or they got some sort of superpower. And I think in that film, it still manages to make T'Challa the main character. Here I felt it very much was still kind of like balancing between Yelena and Natasha a lot of the times. But then I suppose because the storyline of like sisterhood and family is so strong, then that kind of does make sense. And again, like I said earlier, you couldn't kind of do like, let's do like a focus on purely on Natasha or like her backstory and everything, because we know a lot of that already. So I think it's also interesting that they kind of, somewhat shoehorned in this kind of like, you killed my mum. That's a typical trope as well of like, so I'm going to get revenge on you. It's such a small part of it in some ways. I think the stronger elements still came through in the essence of when she was like, look, this is all fake. And when she has that argument with Melina, and, they have their issues with Alexei, and she sort of offends Yelena, etc. I think that all of that is probably where the strengths are, and when she's talking to Melina and trying to find out more and talking about the life they lived and the sacrifices they had to make, etc. And of course, even like the moments with the, what do you call him, the informant guy who gets her the helicopter and all of that kind of stuff. Even there, that's touching on the elements of like friendship. Does she have any real friends? All of that kind of stuff, which leads nicely into Infinity War and Endgame. So yeah, I think that the story for her works quite well in that sense. But again, as a character, she's naturally quite sort of like drawn back and stuff anyway. So your expectations of a solo film can't be that like, yeah, Black Widow, she's going to take over this entire film kind of thing. It's very much still like she's still there with an assembly of characters. So it somewhat stays true to the character of Black Widow in a lot of ways, but then doesn't give you perhaps what you want in a solo film. So I think it sort of balances a lot of the time. So I think that the story works well for her overall in that sense. You get the sense of family, history, and the emotions, and the performances as well, help a lot. Like that scene again where they're at Melina's house, and Kelly mentioned, even though that's a trope with the like it was real to me, Florence Pugh like performed the hell out of that so well that it really, especially on the second watch, I was like, oh, wow, this is actually choking me up a lot more because I was watching her performance a bit more, I guess. But even the same with Natasha, she tears up and she kind of like gets quite emotional. So all of that works really well. They all brought this kind of element of like, we've got this history as a family unit and we're going to use it in this scene. And I think that's where the director obviously, shone as well. I think that she really, brought that element of like drama. So, credit to Kate Shortland for that as well. But yeah, in terms of, like everything else is kind of like, it's a great sort of mission sort of film. The second time I was a lot happier with just like the pacing. It kind of like goes along at a decent pace. I think it's just that, I just think that they bring in Dreykov too late into the film. I think they either should have just like left him so you didn't know that Dreykov was actually alive and it was like a mystery up until the end, or you could have seen a bit more of him kind of like getting at her. Kind of like in the Hunger Games, I was a kind of like Katniss and Snow were always like, goading each other kind of thing. They could have done something like that. But I think that the fact that they're like, where is he? And then like he's there in this spaceship thing at the end, I was a bit like, and then it all pins itself on that last act, which is you just don't get the dramatic build up to it, because it's a relationship that you've only seen for the first time really at that moment.
I think it's interesting because I think, not just us three, but I think the general consensus, everybody seems to be on the same wavelength with this film, that, the performances and the themes are fantastic, because that is what carried me through this film, is that because I like what they're trying to say about found family, and the deeper stuff behind trafficking and all of that sort of great stuff. But I had a problem with how it was used narratively within a film, because it felt like it was in a way trying to be two films. It was like a character piece on Natasha, but also this big espionage sort of, end of the world type of thing, which I did have some problems with that as well. I just think it's entertaining enough, the plot, but it's nothing new. Like, I just feel as if it could have this type of film could have easily fit in like a phase 2, phase 3 type of film. And like the fact that it draws a lot of comparisons to the Captain America, the Winter Soldier, like a lot of the narrative beats, the tone, visual style, a lot of it was very similar to the Winter Soldier. So, and in my opinion, I felt the Winter Soldier did that on a much higher level and much higher scale. But, at the same time, I think, like I said, the themes and the performances are carrying me through this. Like, we're starting with Scarlett Johansson. Like, I thought she was absolutely stellar in this movie. And it's funny because I've been saying this a lot for all the recent Disney Plus shows, that I've said that Elizabeth Olsen in WandaVision, this is the best she's ever played the character. Anthony Mackie, this is the best he's ever played Sam Wilson. And now I'm saying the same for Tom Hiddleston. This is the best he's ever played with Loki. And I have to say that even though Scarlett Johansson has been in a lot of films, she's got a big legacy within the MCU, I almost feel as if this is the best performance she's ever had as the character. And like by the end of it, you're wondering why it's taken them so long to make this. Like, you're just blown away with what she's able to do, like the ease and comfort that she has with the role. Like, there's some really great acting moments from Scarlett Johansson. Like, and there's a lot of, it's whether it's simple, back and forth with the guy who gets the equipment, like you said, Dave, about that sort of friendliness there, or there's really tense emotional back and forth with her family and Florence Pugh, or she's great in the more action-focused stuff. There's just a lot here to savor and enjoy from Scarlett Johansson's performance. But I know we all want to talk about Florence Pugh, but let's talk about the lead first. Kelly, what did you think of Scarlett Johansson's performance in this?
I love it. I think Scarlett Johansson really comes out of this, as you said, I think it's the best she's ever played this role. She really sells it on every emotional level. You've got these really tense moments that are just, you can see every calculation in her brain of working out where someone is, what her next move is, all the way through to these like really sad moments with Yelena towards the end of the film. But one bit that really stands out to me is how funny she can be as well. There's some moments in that truck stop, like Florence Pugh will snatch it from the grasp at the very end with that lovely posing moment. But there's some really lovely sort of banterous back and forth that I just think they are on complete levels with each other. And it's one of those times that we see Black Widow let her guard down. We see Natasha let her guard down. And she's really just enjoying spending time with someone who understands her completely. They've been through the same lived experience. And I also think we're seeing this amazing acting from Scarlett Johansson because she's getting that backstory. She's getting all these things about her family filled in, which we don't know whether she knew them before. Because it could be the case that they've had this script and they've known this was going to happen for years. Like, obviously, I think it's been like 5 years, something like that. We've been waiting on this one. Fair while. I don't know how many script revisions it went through. But she may have not known all the ins and outs of this sort of family dynamic. To then have this film where that dynamic is all out on the table, you're really getting her full rounded sort of life experience, and this character really flourishes.
Dave, do you have anything else to add regarding Scarlett Johansson's performance?
think that when we're talking about this film about like how it is, and how they were kind of like cornered into the way they have to make it, at the end of the day, it's still kind of like a checklist of a Marvel film and what you would expect from a Black Widow film, which I think a lot of these MCU films are like, right, people expect this, people expect that, Hulkbuster, yep. And so a lot of people saying, yeah, it's a solid MCU film. Well, it makes sense because it's still doing that kind of checkbox thing. But I think that ties into Scarlett Johansson's performance, because while originally you might have thought like, oh, they're just doing the Budapest stuff, her performance in that scene, she makes it real. Like when she goes like, oh, what's with the bullets and everything, she's just like, and when she's doing the Budapest stuff and saying about they were arrows, she's kind of just doing it in a very natural and kind of like nuanced way, which I don't think that many other actresses could do. They might kind of like ham it up, or they might sort of like over, I suppose, hamming it up would be overperforming it, or just kind of not make it seem like an actual lived experience. They would be kind of playing the part in that moment. But because she's somebody who's played this character for so long, and she understands the importance of those checklist moments, they kind of gone, yep, we have to have something to do with Budapest. Yep, we need to have something to do with being a spy thriller. We need to have something to do with the Red Room. It's amazing that she can bring in all these different experiences and showcase that on screen.
Why do you guys do that thing?
Do what?
That thing you do when you're fighting. And this thing that you do when you whip your hair when you're fighting with the arm and the hair, and you do like a fighting pose. It's a fighting pose. You're a total poser.
I'm not a poser.
Oh, come on. I mean, they're great poses, but it does look like you think everyone's looking at you like all the time.
All that time that I spent posing, I was trying to actually do something good to make up for all the pain and suffering that we caused. Trying to be more than just a trained killer.
Well, then you were fooling yourself. Because pain and suffering is every day, and we are both still a trained killer. Except I'm not the one that's on the cover of a magazine. I'm not the killer that little girls call their hero.
Right, let's talk about it then, because we've all been dying to talk about this character. Yelena Belova, played by Florence Pugh. I can see you waiting to be released, Kelly. So talk about this wonderful performance.
So I love everything that Florence Pugh has done that I have seen. The fact that she went from Midsummer to Little Women back to back is still the most impressive thing I know about her. But I think she plays the little sister incredibly well. She does it in Little Women. She plays Amy. And then as Yelena, she's got this similar sort of attitude, because I'm the younger sister and I can be a little bit petty about things. Particular great moment that I love is when Alexei tells her that they've got enough fuel to get them to St. Petersburg. She's like, okay. And then the next scene is that helicopter coming straight out of the sky. It makes me giggle. She's really got some great comedic chops on her, and that's props to the writing as well. There's some really great moments of comedy. There's some really sad moments. I genuinely teared up at American Pie, because I just think that little moment, well, just melted me. But I think I think that character is going to bring a lot to this next phase of the MCU. We're going to talk a little bit about that post-credit scene and where this is going. But I think Yelena has obviously been trained as this assassin, and we're going to get that character come through. Hopefully not as a Black Widow Mark II, as a fully rounded version of herself. And I think Florence Pugh is going to bring a lot to the table as well with that.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more with you. I thought Florence Pugh is stellar, absolutely stellar. Like, it's incredible to see that how young she is, and already building up this incredible resume. Like, she's just so relaxed in this role and interesting, and like you want to connect to her. Like you sense her vulnerability, the vulnerability of being a displaced youth. Never really had a family other than this found family that she's got. And it's just so potent throughout these interactions. Like, one of my favorite moments is it's the first time she makes a comment about Natasha's posing, when they're in that little shop and she gets down on the floor. She's like, you do this, and why do you do this with the hair? And I just thought it's so funny, absolutely hilarious. And she's just selling it because I felt that sort of sibling sort of relationship between them, like just throwing jabs at each other. I do that with my siblings and things like that. So yeah, it just, so good. And then, but she also has the really emotional parts. Like, I actually thought some of her best acting was when she wasn't saying any lines. I go to when they were around the dinner table, when Natasha and Melina and Alexia are all having a conversation amongst themselves. She's just doing these little facial expressions, these little things with her eyes, with her lips, holding herself. She's like, oh, I want to say something, but no, I'm gonna hold myself back, or else I'll get hurt, like that, until she finally breaks at the end. It's absolutely incredible just to see the little details of acting, and I think that's what separates, good actors from great actors. It's the little details like that.
I think there's a really great moment in that scene, just before she stops talking, where she says, "I don't want anything to eat." And she's completely ignored. And that just sets off this full facial emotion for the rest of that scene, as she's constantly talked over and they almost forget that she's there. And that is just stellar acting. You can feel every emotion that's going through her, especially if you've ever been at a dinner table and you've been talked over. What that feels like. And I commend her for everything in this role.
Yeah, and I would be interested as well, because something we talked about after seeing it at our second screening was the accent. I think she there's been some dodgy Russian accents over the years in different films and television shows. I think she does a fantastic job. It adds to the character. It gives her such sass, and she delivers it expertly. But we kind of disagreed on it. I felt that she could carry on. So Kelly, would you like to see her keep the accent, do you think?
Oh, I don't know. I think it would be interesting if she kept it. However, I'm imagining we've probably been back to Ohio. We've been there for a while. That's probably the way they're going to play it if we go back to that American accent. But it would be nice to see the accent stay. I think it just depends how they want to play it as we move forward.
Yeah. I just don't know if we would lose some of the comedic sass that accent has, of just putting people down, or saying certain things. And it just makes her different as well. I think, it again makes it more of an international team if she's going to be in the Avengers or anything like that. But you guys also said, about her being a Black Widow point two. Well, this film perfectly sets up that that's not going to happen, because she literally would go after doing any of those poses or anything. So she almost, in that moment, they're you can never make her just a carbon copy of Black Widow, because in this film we have particularly said that she is disgusted by the idea of being that character. So I think that was one of my favorite moments, when she oh, disgusting, when she did the pose moment, which is a great way to set up a joke, and so well pulled off by Florence Pugh in that moment. Like you guys said, the dinner scene is excellent. The American Pie, sing along sort of moment is great. Again, it's that subtlety that she has. She doesn't sing along straight away. The fact that she's singing it out of sync with David Harbour, I think works really well, because it's kind of a more natural, emotional way. And the way that she even says I don't want to speak to you, get out, and she holds that kind of as we've all experienced of she's gone to a room or wherever, she's locked herself away, and she's all scrunched up, no, just leave me alone. And she doesn't want to break free of that. And then as soon as he does, she's God damn it, he got me. And you can see that on her face, which is great. But also just in her action moments as well, I think that's why I was so compelled by the idea that she said, I was completely taken over by this. I was somebody living in a different body. I couldn't control it. I think that I found that really compelling. The fact that she said she killed, a fellow agent and widow, which was devastating to her. So I wanted more from that for the script. And I think that, again, this is nothing to do with Florence Pugh, but I think script-wise, it's a shame that when they say, oh, Elena, the greatest assassin in the world's known, I was I would have liked to maybe seen a bit about that, or known how that that title comes about. And I think that's probably my issue with just the widows overall, is just they kind of just come in at the start and they come in at the end. You don't really sort of see them as the big threat or what Dreykov sort of wants to do with them. But as far as what we get with Florence Pugh, it's excellent, and especially in the action moments at the end when probably the moment actually in the middle, which is the breakout scene. The fact there's not many, a lot of actors could pull off the kind of like, look how cool I am, I have a rocket launcher, but the fact she just so confidently struts over, opens this door and just goes, yep, I'm just doing this, and she looks like somebody who's been trained in the military. I completely bought that she knew how to use that rocket launcher. It wasn't a kind of like, sexualized or like, oh, look how like hot I look with this. It was a very like competent, yeah, I'm gonna do this, shoot it off, look kind of like, badass doing it, and be like, yep, that's done. So that's what sort of happened throughout the rest of the film when she did her action, and that's fantastic. Also, I'm kind of like intrigued what Kelly thought as well, because something I didn't mention to people before, one of my favorite moments was when they were like, oh, well, that wouldn't happen because I don't have a uterus. And when she's literally like, they pull it out, and like the actions she's doing, the hand movements, and she was like, oh, well, I was going to speak about fallopian tubes, but okay.
Yeah, I even read somewhere that it was entirely non-scripted. That was just
wow.
Florence Pugh
wow.
improvising, which ultimately just makes it so much better. I laughed so hard. I genuinely think that's such a good moment because it's one of those jokes that's so tailored to women because we know it makes men uncomfortable. And it just it's one of those things that only the women in the audience laughed. And you could just see, like, there are a couple of guys sat near us, and one of them just went, just shoulders shrugged, like, nope. But then it's also interesting, like, on another hand, to be like, oh, forced hysterectomies, should we be laughing about that? It's played off as a joke, but it's a way of them dealing with that trauma. And I think that's something that there's a couple of characters who do that, like Thor, after his, like, depressive episode. That's quite an interesting one to look at, and that comedy there. But yeah, I do think genuinely overall, like, it's a very good moment. And I think David Harbour plays that sort of father figure against it just so well. Like, the two of them back and forth, like, that whole dynamic is so funny.
So, here's what's gonna happen.
Natasha, don't slouch.
I'm not slouching.
Yes, you are. You're going to
I
get
don't slouch.
You're going to get the back hunch.
Listen to your mother.
Oh my God, this...
Up.
All right, enough. All of you.
I didn't say anything. That's not fair.
Here's what's gonna
I
happen.
don't want any food.
Eat a little something, you
Hey,
lady.
you're gonna tell us the location of the Red Room.
You know, it's like when you told them that they could stay up late to catch Santa Claus.
Oh, that was fun. You come down the chimney, girl. Look out. Where is he? You wait for him, and then when the cookies are gone, then you see he's there. No, I want them to follow their dreams.
No good.
Reach for the stars, girl.
Let's move on to the parents of this found family. Starting with Rachel Weisz. Now, I think out of the four main characters, I didn't connect to her as much as the other three. I did think she is fantastic as Melina. Like, she had this unexpected charm to her, quite engaging, and she also isn't as predictable as you might think. Like, I actually went into this film kind of thinking, I have a funny suspicion that Rachel Weisz's character is Taskmaster, because I was like, in the trailers, like, Taskmaster is never in the same shot as Melina. So I was trying to piece it together. So they did fool me on that. So well done, Bert. But then for me, it's David Harbour. Like, he almost steals the movie for me. Florence Pugh is the one that steals the movie, but he's just behind her. I think he's just so incredibly charming and funny, and you also feel for him. He's just like this big cuddly bear. You just want to put your arms around him, and he just does an incredible job of bringing the character of Red Guardian to life. Like, he's given him so much pathos, so many levels to play. He's a guy as well constantly being compared to Captain America, and how he navigates through the movie. It leads to some really funny moments, but also some really touching and tender moments as a father figure, as you mentioned, Kelly, between him and Yelena when he's American Pie. But for me, I have to go back to, again, the dinner table sequence is just fantastic. And when Melina is telling Natasha, hey, don't slouch, you're going to get a back hunch. And then he replies, yes, listen to your mother. Up, up, up. Like, just the interplay of that. I'm just like, I've been in this exact situation. Like, every person has been in a family dinner and you have one of the parents, hey, so, don't slouch, sit still, eat this and all that. It just felt so real and authentic to me. So I love both of the parents, but I have to say, David Harbour almost stole the show for me. I just thought he was fantastic. Dave, what did you think of the Red Guardian and Melina?
I didn't feel he almost stole the show. I think that Yelena definitely does that. I think that the script holds him back enough, and I think that he plays it in a way that's not overly stupid or anything like that. They don't the best jokes in a way are reserved for Natasha and Yelena. Obviously, he does kind of have a great moment with that, my father would go toilet in my hand, that was, just perfectly added to the awkwardness of that situation. And again, Florence Pugh just perfectly doing this kind of child, oh my God, why is my dad doing this kind of thing? But just, it made me think about the way that he performed it. It wasn't even just that my father peed in my hands. It's just the fact that he says, my father go toilet. And so he it sounds even more disgusting. And then he emphasizes, he urinate on my hand. And so at parts of the film, I felt that when he was in the prison, he's doing the arm wrestling stuff. I kind of thought that was kind of typical, tropey kind of stuff. It wasn't bad or anything. I was just okay, we've seen this a few times. The getting into the costume stuff was fun. I'm a bit disappointed we didn't maybe get to see a bit more action from him at the end, considering, he's oh, I'm the Red Guardian, I'm the Red Guardian. We didn't really get to see that much of him actually, with his own shield or anything like that. But he still, served his purpose. Again, used for quite comic effect when he's oh, girls, listen to me. But he doesn't have the earpiece. That's great. But I'd also say probably my favorite moments of him, and again, I was kind of torn on the way I felt about it, but him as sort of the American dad, that moment at the beginning was very powerful. And you could see the sincerity of when he's my girls are the strongest girls in the world. And when he lets them go and everything like that. I think because of the issues with Dreykov and everything, they could have made a bigger impact of just he let them go and they got pulled away. And obviously you have to do that whole kind of he throws me in prison. They had to kind of just mention a lot of that in the script without showing it. But still, that moment in which he encourages them and says the strongest girls in the world, that was one of the biggest strengths of that moment. And that he played that really well. And in some ways, he feels quite a different character at that point to who the Red Guardian is. So for me, it was two different people. But I suppose that was the point of being a undercover spy or whatever. So he did his job in that sense. But yeah, and the second time I found myself a lot more enjoying Rachel Weisz, because the first time I was kind of there watching the entire time, she's just going to be evil or something like that. And then they have the whole disguise thing with the mask and everything, so it was a bit eye roll worthy then. And they give her a lot of bad scenes and bits of dialogue, so nothing to do with Rachel Weisz, but when she blows up the propeller and she has that awkward shot in which she just walks past yes, I have caused the thing to blow up. So script wise, she doesn't have the best role or the best lines, but again, she manages to do a very convincing Russian accent. She has a lot of emotion in that interplay between her and Natasha, in which she was saying, we had this part to play. We were forced to do what we did. And I think that you can generally feel the sense of when she calls them cowards, that really hits home for her, that she was just what else could we do? We had to do this. And even though they're we personally have been affected by your decisions and all these people around the world have, and their outlook is that we were great parents, we served our part well, and there's nothing else we could do because we would just be killed. But at that moment, you can see in her face that she's yeah, you know what? I can do something about this and I can change it. And I think that that's why it's nice that she does play this active role in taking down Dreykov rather than just being oh, I was villainous all along. It's that the film itself kind of acknowledges what you expect by having the disguise thing. That's the one, that's the credit I'll give it, is that when you see her oh, yes, I've brought you Black Widow, he's oh, thank you, I could always trust you. And then when it turns out that isn't her, you're oh, wow, okay, you've actually thrown us a curveball, and it's a sort of double agent kind of moment, which is great. So she's essentially a bit like Snape. But so I thought that she had some nice moments, like you said, the back hunch, like with the pigs and everything when she's, like talking through the, like, he still had 11 seconds of breathing left and all that kind of stuff. You believe that she's the smart woman she is. And also, again, my favorite line probably at the end, like, yes, I'm clearly injured, and she's like being brought off the wreckage and everything like that. So personally, like, she's actually one of the ones, apart from Yelena, obviously, I would like to see again, because I think that there's a lot more potential with the character. I think that I would love to see her in a kind of like lead-in role, like, as some head of an organization or something. I would like to see her. To me, Red Guardian might be a kind of one and done thing, but who knows?
No, I need to see. I need to see this guy back, man. I need to.
Yeah.
I feel like I'm going to defend Red Guardian here, because I feel as if it's an intentional sort of the lack of action they gave him, because I feel it's part of his character that he's boasting that he's done all these wonderful things, and but really he's an old guy now. He's trying to get back in his costume, all that sort of thing. So when he does fight Taskmaster at the end, he's struggling. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
He is struggling. And like just before that, he was like, I just want to break something. And I did like Rachel Weisz's counterline says, well, there's something you can break as Taskmaster walks through. So I liked what they actually did with the character, because they're showing that he's just this old guy trying to live his glory days, but it's not there. It's not there. It's just so good. But Kelly, what did you think of the parents?
Yeah, you've almost got this really fun idea of like a divorced couple, like they're divorced parents, because he's gone on to have his midlife crisis thinking that he's the Red Guardian again, and she's just trying to get on with her peaceful little life in the country with her pigs. I do agree that Rachel Weisz didn't get the best scripting. She didn't get the best moments. But I have to admit, the bit where she breaks her and Alexei out of the little prison cells and is like, what did you expect? I made them. And then you get that reveal of the mask. I just think that you can see this like mutual pride of each other between them. Like, they're like, we know we did a bad thing and we know we haven't been great. However, we can be proud of each other in this moment because we're doing the right thing now. But David Harbour really just clinches it for me of the two of them. He weirdly reminds me of my own dad. I think it might be that American Pie moment of just like, I don't want to talk to you. Okay, I'll come and sit with you then. And he just sits there with Yelena. And then they just have this one moment with this song that was obviously so important to her when she was a child, to just bring that connection back round after they've had this big fallout. And I think it's really nice to show like this father-daughter relationship that was once really quite severed, that's now coming back together a little bit, because we don't see that huge amount. But he's got such an effortless way of being on screen. Like, he's just so funny physically that you just like, he's going to be a good time when he's on screen. And I think him and Rachel Weisz have signed a couple more movies. So I think we're going to see them both, which is exciting.
I had to put a chip in the back of her neck. In the back of her neck. Look at her. You find it difficult to look at her. I do. She watches everything. And she can do it. She's a perfect mimic. And she fights just like all of your friends.
Let's talk about Taskmaster then, because, Taskmaster was a villain that a lot of fans were excited to see. He's a character within the comics that is hugely popular. I think this is the biggest flaw of the movie. It's the interpretation of Taskmaster, is that there's just no personality. Like, I think comic readers recognize Taskmaster, that it has a lot of one-liners, some attitude, a very colorful persona, but in Black Widow is reduced to this silent assassin who has a few... Don't get me wrong, the action scenes that Taskmaster are used in is fantastic. The fight choreography is amazing, but I didn't care for Taskmaster. And when it's revealed to be Dreykov's daughter, I was like, okay, I like that twist, but I just felt there could have been more done to the character of Taskmaster. Like, like Dave said, I think the reveal of Dreykov should have made for the end, and then have Taskmaster be this constant threat, like, and Natasha maybe Natasha thinks, Taskmaster's running the Red Room, that sort of thing. We got to take the Taskmaster down. But to constantly be like, it's Dreykov, it sort of takes away the impact Taskmaster should have as this main antagonist. Because the design's cool, like I said, the fight choreography is cool, but there's just nothing there for us to attach to this villain. But Kelly, what did you think of Taskmaster and also Dreykov as well, and how they were used?
Yeah, I think Taskmaster's a really interesting concept as a villain, because it's able to mimic, which is such an interesting thing for a fight scene. If they know exactly what you're going to do next, you can't be it's not your usual fighting style. You've got to go with something completely different, and that brings that jeopardy into it. I do think the twist was a great idea. It was such a good idea to have Dreykov's daughter as Taskmaster. However, there is an unfortunate relationship between a disability and being a villain. Could we not have just had this as someone completely different, or an animatronic? Could this not have been an android? We've got wizards and androids and all that good stuff, and aliens. There we go. So could that have just been a completely separate entity that Dreykov had made? It didn't have to be his daughter. It could have been completely separate. But that's just looking at it from that sort of perspective. Would have been really nice to have had a bit more personality there. Maybe even a little bit more distorted dialogue, something like that, just to make that character really pop. Because at the minute it just feels there's that robot person. They're going to fight now. There's no quips. There's nothing like that. It's just, they're going to fight now. And we know this is probably going to end badly. With Dreykov, I do agree. We should have seen more of that villain, either all the way through, more prominent, or it should have just been kept to the very end. Let's make that such a massive reveal. Because we've done floating planets in the sky before. We're going to do another one again, because that's what we love. It's lights in the sky, big old pillars of light, aliens coming down, or planets, or little floating islands. Let's not do another one. But yeah, I think Ray Winston was such an interesting choice for that role. I think the persona was there, but I don't think that character was either fleshed out enough, or it just wasn't enough to be scary. I needed him to terrify me as a woman who would have been in that position had I lived in this universe, to have been snatched at some point, possibly. That character should be scary, and he wasn't. He was mediocre at best.
I think they were just always obsessed with this idea of wouldn't it be great if this film ended with this battle through the sky, something blows up and they're flying through, and maybe the James Bond-esque nature of Moonraker or something. They're space station, all that kind of stuff. But the problem is just it doesn't kind of fit with the world of the Red Room and the Widows, because it's a very covert kind of underground secret mission. And yeah, I get the idea of they were above, everyone thought they were underground. Yeah, clever little twist in that sense. But it's just the actual technology around it, the fact that it's kind of a very sci-fi kind of, even Winter Soldier doesn't, they have those helicarriers with the turrets and stuff, but they're very much a military looking kind of design and machine. It's not kind of this very sci-fi sort of Captain Scarlet looking spaceship, which doesn't seem to fit in with the aesthetics of what you expect of the Red Room. But that's the problem, is we never know those aesthetics because we never see it. The only time we do is in the opening credit sequence, in which you're just seeing cutting back and forth between the Natasha being trained and all the other sort of widows being trained. And you were saying about Dreykov's plan, he wants domination and he wants power, but apparently he also wants access to all the world's little girls, which was just a weird line and was like, okay, you know, like, because I think even if they went about it in a kind of like Kingsman, for example, where Sam Jackson was like, oh, you know, the planet is sick and, you know, this is my, you know, idea as to how we're going to cure global warming, essentially. You know, even if he went about it in a kind of like, you know, I think that women are the dominant species or something like that, or this is why they're so much better than men or something. But no, he's just kind of like, yeah, I like girls. And you're like, okay, that's a bit weird. But like, there's no context as to why. We never see why that's a good thing. So, and it's just, so it's very much all of the, like, the plot and the motives just thrown in at the end. And as well, like, Hollywood does this a lot. Like, why have, like, one of the most famous kind of, like, London British actors known for playing this, like, you know, brawler part of, like, you know, the gangster, play a Russian? Like, I think they were just in love with this idea of, like, yeah, Ray Winston as the villain in Black Widow. It's like, but why? You know, like, too bad they already used Mads Mikkelsen. He probably would have been a lot, you know, a lot better. But
good.
so when you hear like Dreykov, oh, Dreykov survived, I killed Dreykov and everything, and then you see him and you're just like, oh, that's Dreykov? I'm like, oh, okay. So yeah, I the only bit of credit I will give it is that they do have, like, when he like holds his hand and she like flinches, the performance and the interplay between them, I think they performed that really well, and that they really focused. I think Kate Shortland obviously sort of went, okay, well, I haven't got a lot to play with here, but I'm going to make this scene count. So I think it does hit quite hard, like when he's literally, you know, punching her, and he, you know, he holds his hand up and she sort of flinches with the, you know, the pheromone thing. I think that they very much make the use of that scene, and it, you know, it doesn't then cripple the entire film. But it's just too bad that was the only thing that we got. But I think Kate Shortland made the most of it, made the most of Ray Winston, in that, again, it wasn't a laughable performance. It wasn't a terrible accent. It just could have been better if you cast somebody else and you had more throughout the film. I was kind of intrigued as to what Kelly thought as well with the widows themselves. Like, did you feel that they were like well utilized, or because I felt it was kind of like you saw them at the beginning slightly chasing after Yelena, etc. You saw them at the end, which was quite like plots, you know, like convenient, like, yes, this gas has just immediately cured them all. I didn't feel that, you know, I was excited for this film thinking like, oh, wow, you know, so many Black Widows. How great is this going to be for like action and that kind of stuff? But I never felt that, you know, they could have had one widow who's like, you know, really good at like martial arts or something like that. And they could have had like little different styles, or you could have seen the Winter Soldier effect of like him taking out different targets. You could have had that with the widows, but we never really see what they are capable of or what the threat they bring. But I don't know, what did you think of that? Were you still happy to see the kind of like the action they had? Or
I think this is where like the Taskmaster thing really comes into play, because if we had gotten rid of Taskmaster as a character in this film, kept Taskmaster as a possibility for like a later Marvel film with the whole bunch, you could have used these individual widows for those sort of assailants throughout the film. Because I, for one, would have really enjoyed seeing a 12-year-old girl trying to, like, kill Natasha Romanoff. Because that's what they're trained to do. And I think that would have been really interesting to see Natasha struggle to fight with this, like, incredibly well-trained assassin. I think there's a really, like, the one moment that does sit well with me is, apart from the fact that they should both be dead from the fall, is where Natasha and Yelena are leaving the building in Budapest, and that widow falls to the floor. With that, I think that moment where you see her like physically take herself out, super like, what moment? Like I was there like mouth open, like what just happened? I think that sets up a lot that happens later on with that argument at the house with like talking about the mind control stuff. I think that's really interesting. I would have loved to have seen more of the widows, and I would have loved to have seen more of that like training stuff that comes in with Dreykov being in it more as well. Because if we'd had him as more like cutaways and seen him training these girls, and seeing like his motivations throughout, seeing what he wanted, that would have come into play with seeing more of the widows, which I think would have been much better for the film. But they decided to go with that sort of family angle rather than taking a full Russian spy thriller, which works both in its favor and against it. I do have to admit, though, I hate pheromone blockers. Pheromone blockers is my least favorite thing about the entire Dreykov scene, because I'm like, you could have at least picked someone other than Ray Winston, who at least was like, because when I think of like pheromones, you think of like an attractive man or an attractive person, and I'm like, none of these girls is attracted to Ray Winston. Like, there might be some, but none of those widows are.
You're just like, he's just like, whenever you sell my sweat, you like, you will then be blocked from hurting me. And they're like, oh, I can smell his sweat. Like,
Come on now, we're just going to press buttons and hack computers. I mean, I don't know, there's nothing for me to do, and I want to break something.
Oh, there is something you can break.
Melina, this is the last time that we... Damn it.
So let's go into maybe some of the other like filmmaking aspects and stuff that we like. Action, cinematography, the score, whatever comes to mind. I mean, for me, I really like the huge scale of this film. Like, I really like that they embraced the spy espionage. We're going to Morocco and Budapest and Norway and really creating this huge scale, this true to like the globe-trotting adventures of like Bourne, Bond, and all these wonderful espionage movies. And I also, when me and Dave were watching the credits roll up and we're looking at all the different shooting units, I really appreciated that, again, they took the time to actually go to these countries, to shoot in these countries, to create that authentic globe-trotting feel. So yeah, I love that. And I thought the cinematography as well was, I enjoyed it much more than I thought I would. Sometimes with a lot of Marvel movies, sometimes the cinematography can be a bit bland. They sort of, a lot of people say they sort of look the same. But I actually really thought it was stellar here. Like, the action sequences in the sky, exceptional, really beautiful, and some of the composition of the shots, just really affecting. I just think it's stellar. Movements, fight choreography, fantastic, and it's part of the reason why I give this film more, I look over some of the stuff, because seeing these action sequences on the big screen is just something else. But Kelly, any other sort of aspects of this film that come to mind for you? Yeah,
The stunt work that was done for this film, clearly, like, very impressive. The fight in the kitchen with Yelena and Natasha when they first meet in Budapest, I held my breath for the whole lot of it. It was so intricate, and there were so many like props and things that were needed for that. And speaking of props, like the set designs, Melina's house is just the most comforting looking place to then have this like weird, like dark undertone to it. You just get this really like unsettled feeling there. And the sparseness of like the Red Room scenes and that big office, and then those just devoid of anything training rooms. I think you get this real difference between what Natasha and Yelena had when they were first in Ohio with this like family home, lots of things, to them being in the Red Room where there's nothing but themselves and their own will to survive. I think like that just really just collects everything really nicely. Plus that little costuming detail of Yelena's jacket. Women don't have enough pockets. I'm using this podcast as a platform for women's clothing to have more pockets. And that just being a really lovely moment where she's just talking about how many things she can store in it. And then thinking on to Infinity War. Is Infinity War next? Yeah, where Natasha's wearing that jacket for the whole film. And it's just this really nice like continuity. She just loved us and stuff, and I love that.
Yeah, take away from the epicness of Yelena. She was just running around with a clutch bag. No. So, yeah, I think Kelly touched on a good point with the stunt work, because actually, again, Marvel is pretty good at this anyway, but there wasn't a point in which you were like, that's not Florence Pugh, that's not Scarlett Johansson. You believed that, they were doing those stunts. So that was really great in the sense that you believed who they were. They obviously were like hiding it well. They did some great stuff in terms of the physical movement. And like Ali said, your breath was taken away. Don't put some curtains around your neck when you're like watching that scene, because like when they were like choking, I was like, oh my God, But as you also mentioned, the design work is fantastic, because in that flat in Budapest, you can really get a sense of the history there, not just the arrows in the wall, but even the arrows, like they're a great example of not being like, right, here's this visibly obvious thing. It's kind of, they're put in there. You can see that they're just all like worn in. It's not like an obvious, they've just been stabbed in straight away. And I think you've got like a few just nice touches within that flat. I was trying to like see the second time. I think there's some form of poster in one of the rooms, and I was trying to work out if it was like a James Bond poster or something, because Natasha was watching James Bond earlier in the film. So if that is what that was, it was hard to see, but that's a nice touch. Also into, like you said, Jake, the cinematography is fantastic. Budapest looks fantastic. The scene on the bridge when Taskmaster first attacks Natasha looks absolutely stunning, because you got like the warmth of the fire, but also the coldness of the dark scenario they're in, and the bridge lights. Some great action work there, as Taskmaster's like jumping over it with the shield and all the stuff with like zip wire in them, and that's all your kind of classic Black Widow action thriller kind of stuff, is grappling hooks and all that kind of stuff. So that was great. I also think that the fight with the widows, even though it has that kind of like hokey end with the the solution at the end, but the actual fight in between them is excellent for that. And I think that you really felt that those women were the fighters. Again, they weren't kind of all like Playboy models or anything like that. It seemed like they were genuine stunt women. They were all of like different ethnic backgrounds, which was also great. And this is something we talked about before with like Justice League and things like that. And, Wonder Woman is when you have like, the women of like Themyscira, etc., the Amazons. You don't want them to just be like hypersexualized warriors. You want them to be realistic looking warriors, so I think there you could see that certain women had like their hair tied back and in braids and stuff, which was like, yeah, that's practical. Like a woman who's doing this kind of work would do that. They wouldn't have like a kind of like blown out curly hairstyle, etc. So I think that was really realistic and good on the costume designer's part. And also the white Black Widow suits just look excellent, and I think that they did some really good work there on the costumes. Having like the great gold gauntlets on the black costume was fantastic. And as Kelly said, even that set with Rachel Weisz's character, you can see in the background she has all the wigs and stuff, all the typical kind of spy stuff. So that was great. And lastly, just the score, a great score from Lorne Barth. The epic, like, Russian, like, oh, like all the choirs. You have to get some like good choral choir stuff in there. Bit, bummed out that we didn't get like the Red Choir Army in here at some point, but I think that you replicated that quite well in the score. It very much was an epic score. Maybe it would have been nice if we had like maybe just like a very emblematic theme of like Natasha or Yelena.
The trailer theme, man. The trailer theme.
Yes. But they had some very sort of touching music when you see like the fireflies and stuff like that. And yeah, the action stuff, like it sounded fantastic.
I'm glad you brought up James Bond, Dave, because I've completely forgot about that scene. But that is actually one of my favorite moments in the whole film, is that this is Natasha when she's truly herself. She's on her own. No one else is around. So she chooses to chill out and watch a James Bond flick. I was just absolutely love it. And she chose Moonraker, which is, in my opinion, arguably the wackiest Bond movie ever made as well. So it kind of like fit for like this wacky spy espionage movie that we're watching as well.
It's also her like saying the lines with the film. It's clearly a favorite of hers. And I think that's such a nice little moment of just like, she's watched this film over and over and over again for one reason or another. And like, we've all got those favorite films that we know all the lines of and we could recite it back to ourselves. So I just like the idea that Natasha has been sat somewhere covert, like waiting to attack, and has just been reciting the script of Moonraker to herself to pass the time.
Well, it's actually a good like arc or like believability, because in Winter Soldier, there's that moment where she turns on the Zola computer and she's like, "Would you like to play a game?" And it's like a really niche, random reference, which is like, oh, like I wouldn't expect Natasha to have known that movie, but this kind of now makes sense after watching that. So it's almost as if they put that in to kind of explain her niche, 80s movies knowledge or something like that. But it's also just like nice to see characters like these nerd out, essentially. Like when you do get a character who's like, yeah, I'm like the big macho jock character and I play football, again, as nerds watching this, you're like, oh, well, I can't relate to this. So when you see then, a character like this being a nerd and just watching films and that kind of stuff, you're just like, yeah, this is relatable for us. But it also gives me like a vision of like, what was the Avengers like headquarters like? Was it just like Wanda in her room watching sitcoms and then Natasha in her room watching James Bond films? I'm like, now I need to know what everyone else was watching.
Well, this is the thing. In my head canon, in Winter Soldier, that Cap's got his little list of everything he needs to listen and do, like to get caught up in the modern world. In my head canon, I can imagine Natasha's like, I've got to sit you down. We've got to watch all the Bond movies. Like I can see her. She's like, come on, like you've got to watch these. This is what we do as a living.
Movie night must be such an interesting time at Avengers Tower, because you've got like Cap just wanting to watch like a film from the 40s, followed by Natasha being like, it's a Bond movie. Vision's like, what's a film? Like, what is this thing? Do I have to just sit here and watch the whole thing without knowing what happens? Wanda's much rather watch television. I think that would be it's a really like weird niche thing to want to know about all these characters. But I'm also like, I bet Sam's got a great favorite film.
Steve is probably one of the few people you could watch like The Sixth Sense with, and he'd be like, oh, he's like, Bruce Willis is dead, so that would be great.
What this woman did, honestly, I can't even imagine.
You're not supposed to be bothering me on my holiday time, Valentina.
Oh, bothering you? Oh, no. I'm just here paying my respects.
Coming here makes you look desperate.
Okay.
I want a raise.
Oh, yeah, you and me both. Believe me, you're gonna earn it. I've got your next target. Thought I'd hand deliver it. Maybe you'd like a shot at the man responsible for your sister's death. Kind of a cutie, don't you think?
Right, the post-credit scene. Now, I have mixed feelings on this post-credit scene. I really enjoy the first half of it, and then the second half of it sort of loses its steam a bit. To go to the beginning, so it's the emotional, Yelena visiting the grave of Natasha. It's a really tender moment. Again, amazing acting from Florence Pugh, who then gets interrupted by Valentina. What was the full name? Costanza. Oh, I can't remember the full name.
Oh, God, yeah.
But anyway, Val, from who we were introduced to in The Falcon and the Winter Soldier. Now, I think Julie Louis-Dreyfus is amazing. I think her comedic timing is great. I think she's playing this character really, really well. And, the nose blow that interrupted the really tender moment and turned it into sort of a joke. Now, I think had any other character maybe done it, it would have ruined the moment. But for me, the fact that it was coming from Julie Louis-Dreyfus and the character that she's playing, what we've already seen from her in The Falcon and the Winter Soldier, I was like, yeah, that totally works. It makes sense for the character, and it's adding to the scene. However, I don't like what follows in that she's saying, oh, well, do you want to find out who really killed your sister? It's this guy. And she shows a picture of Hawkeye. First of all, I'm just like, Dave's the one who pointed it out. I'm just like, they use like a promotional image of like an Avengers movie or something. He's posing like, it just looks a bit weird. Like you could have got like some CCTV footage or something like, oh, here he is. And second of all, we raised this concern when we were reviewing WandaVision, when, Monica, Jimmy, and Darcy are all saying, oh, but in the, Wanda nearly defeated Thanos. Oh, yeah, but Captain Marvel almost had that. Like, were they there? How do they know, like, all the little details of the Battle of Endgame? And this is another thing for me that, why is Val saying that Hawkeye is responsible for Natasha's death? Who is anyone to know who is responsible for Natasha's death? Do you know what I mean? Like, effectively, it happened in real time. They were gone, and then they came back at exactly the moment they left in time in the film Endgame. So, and it all happened in Vormir, a distant planet. So I don't understand how she's come to this conclusion that Hawkeye is responsible for Natasha's death. I'm not sure, and I clearly now it's leading into the Hawkeye series, which I like. I like sort of the angle they're going for, but just something about it, I'm not quite sure. Kelly, what did you think of the post-credit scene and what it means for maybe we think anyway, the Hawkeye series?
Yeah, I completely get what you mean about that, like, comedic switch. If it had been anybody else, wouldn't have worked. Would have been really jarring, would have, like, made me really uncomfortable, because I would have just been like, why are you putting yourself in this situation, in this moment? And yeah, I'm just waiting for the next Marvel film to talk about someone who's written a full-blown expose about what happened. And it's just like, someone's written a book. Doctor Strange has written a book about all of the possibilities of what happened at the Endgame battle, or something daft like that as to why everyone knows. However, I do have to admit, I had a little cry at the whistle, because it only comes up a couple of times in the film. Once at the very beginning, I think it happens like when they're like reunited on the ground after that last battle, and then right at the very end. And it broke my heart a little bit to have Florence Pugh Elena whistle to the gravestone, and you half expect to hear the whistle back. And it gives you that one moment of like, oh, it's going to happen, and then it doesn't come, and it's just like painful in that moment, because you're like, that's grief right there. And then suddenly there's someone who's come to prey off that, who's ready to be like, do you want to go get revenge on someone? And it's very clearly setting up the Hawkeye series, which I'm very excited about. Not for Hawkeye, but for Kate Bishop, and now for Yelena as well. We're going to get some really cool, powerful women in that series now as well. And whether she comes in as this full-blown antagonist, or whether we're going to get this redemption arc of sorts, it'll be interesting to see what they do with her.
Dave, though, what do you think? What's going to happen in the Hawkeye series? I know you have similar issues to me with how it was sort of revealed and stuff.
Yeah, well, the way I explained it as well was like I almost expected Jeremy Renner's autograph to be on the picture, because it just looked that kind of like publicity kind of image. And as well, I know we're in the modern day, but, do we have to always have like, I've got a tablet with it on and all this kind of stuff? It's like, come on, like, we're in a spy film. Let's be a bit more like, nostalgic about it at least. Let's pretend the technology doesn't take over everything. And I think if you were given a secret mission, surely you would want to have something in an envelope which you could burn, so that would also make sense. But mentioning the whistle did also just remind me, just as a sidetrack, the two girls who played young Yelena and Natasha were excellent. Violet McGraw plays young Yelena, which fantastic. It's so rare to find, believable child actors. I won't say good ones because that would just be disrespectful, but I mean like ones that don't seem like stage. But also, interestingly, Eva Anderson, who plays young Natasha, does a great job. She has that moment where she protects Yelena and she's like, I'm not going back there, and you really feel it. But also, I don't know if you know this, Kelly, but she's going to be Wendy in Peter Pan and Wendy. And I'm like, after seeing this film, I'm like, yeah, I can see that.
Yeah, no, I can now.
She looks like a Wendy.
I can see that.
That'll be interesting. Yeah, in terms of the end credit scene, I think it was nice also that they give a hint to, a lot of people who had a problem with hey, why didn't Natasha get a funeral? Why was it just Tony? And this almost give us that as well. I was like, oh, this is nice. Because in a way, you watching the whole film, like, are you gonna reference the fact that she's died, or have some sort of finale in that sense? So at least it give us that as well. It was a nice nod to that. You have a bit of closure on Yelena's part, and you see that obviously she does know of her sister's death, obviously. Like Kelly, I'm imagining that there's going to be something like the press has, asked what happened, and Hawkeye is the one who said, like, it was me and she sacrificed herself. But I think there's just something very, like, tropey and just unbelievable about the fact that they would, like, do you want to know who really killed her? And, like, do you want to get revenge? It's like, I just can't imagine a situation in which anybody would see that and kind of go like, yeah, that's what must have happened. I can imagine somebody would maybe try to take advantage of it and say that, like, oh, do you want to get revenge on them? But I think it kind of takes away from Yelena's character that she would ever believe that. Not that she doesn't need to know Hawkeye or anything, and even if he's an Avenger, obviously Avengers can go bad or whatever. But I don't know, it's just something about the situation in which, why would he kill her? Like, why would there ever be a scenario in which he would have allowed her to die? Surely if he's come back and said she sacrificed herself because she wanted to do it to bring everyone back, I'd imagine somebody like Yelena would be like, that sounds like something she would have done, and I can believe that. I don't think that she would blame him. It just seems like a very childish thing for her to do. So I think that's my problem. So it'll just be interesting to see how it pans out. I think it doesn't seem like a kind of thing Yelena might do. But she also didn't seem to be taking much crap from Val. So she almost could be like going along with it, even though she kind of knows the situation she's in, but going along with it for pay, or for, just to kind of like find out more maybe. Because again, watching it back, like, I was so focused on Val the first time. If you watch Florence Pugh's performance, it's great because she's just looking at her like, oh yeah, I'm supposed to be on vacation, and she's looking at her, and when she's talking, she's like, yeah, and she's like rolling her eyes and everything. I'm like, that's some great, just as we mentioned earlier, like in the family scene, she knows to still act when, like the camera's not on her or when she's not talking. So that's great.
Yeah, Kelly, anything else you'd like to say then? Any closing thoughts on the film before we head on out here then?
Yeah, I think this is it's one that we've been waiting for a while. Black Widow has deserved a film for a long time. And I think to be made now, when steps are being made in terms of the Me Too movement, having more female leads, especially in sci-fi and fantasy, and especially like these superhero genres, I think it suffers in terms of its villains, but is made up for in its entirety of family drama, great performances, a phenomenal soundtrack, and just a really fun story. If you look at it on just like surface level, you can just put it on, enjoy it as a spy action movie without having to worry about any of the darker themes. And just women in general, they're all great. I love it.
I think overall, like I said, it's definitely a strong like part of the MCU. It's a very fun film. It's one, again, you could sort of like imagine putting on or on a weekend and enjoying for all the fun moments and the comedic moments you get. Again, is it like essential viewing for the MCU? No. But it gives us so much that would be great for the future. And I think that something is great with something like Captain Marvel, the other female-led superhero film, is that I've always said that they sort of set up the world of Captain Marvel quite well within that. So they go, right, the supporting characters we're dealing with, the sort of like the Rambeau family, and you've got like Nick Fury and the Skrulls. This kind of does like a similar thing in that it goes like, right, we got Red Guardian, we got Yelena, Melina, these are the characters, this is the world that we're dealing with. So I think if you had another Black Widow film or like a Yelena film or something like that, then you kind of know what you're in store for, and it kind of like, oh, this feels like a Black Widow film, etc. So I think it does a good job in that sense. And it could kind of do the same thing. It could have the opening credit scene and all that, the montage and stuff at the beginning to kind of feel like a part of a series. They could still give Black Widow a trilogy, much like they've given Cap, etc., by carrying on with another character. So I think that's very promising. Again, I wouldn't want to see it like Yelena, Melina, and Red Guardian are all back in the same film, but I think that all of them would be like great to go off into different trajectories, go in, show up in series, show up in films, etc. Probably, like I said, Florence Pugh being the main one that I want to like level up to a film or to have a big part in like an Avengers movie in the future. But also, this is, I think, a good lesson to the MCU to not forget about the like side stories and stuff like that. I don't want it to be like, right, well, everyone wanted that Black Widow film for years. We can say we've done that now, and let's just look to the future, and everything we always do is kind of like Eternal, Shang-Chi, all these big properties. Well, there's no harm in going back sometimes. Like I said, if we want to have, kind of like with Thor, it's almost that we're doing Love and Thunder. It's like, oh, we're having another entry and we're bringing back Jane Foster. We can still do that kind of stuff. We can bring in characters that didn't quite have their time or their moments, or we can go backwards in time. We can bring in like origin stories for characters that, we've only seen bits of in the past. So I think it'd be fun to have that variety. It's not always about the future. You can slot in films. I think ultimately Black Widow would have been probably better received if it was like Civil War, then that film come out. But I'm just saying I don't think we should disregard, our side characters and our supporting characters. Same with like Ant-Man and the Wasp. I think for the Wasp, I would love to see her take a more prominent role now. I think that this film and Captain Marvel is a great example of why the Wasp should be done, in a bigger role, like as great as it is that, it's Ant-Man and the Wasp and they're like a team and all that kind of stuff. She needs to have a bigger role in the next film, and it needs to be more about her. She kind of got shortchanged, I felt, in that Ant-Man film. And I would love to see her take a more prominent role in the future, if not have her own film or be like leader of the Avengers or something. So I think that like going forward, they really need to focus on those key female characters. It can't just be like, oh yeah, we've got Captain Marvel, we've got Black Widow. It's like, no, level up all these other characters as well, which we're getting through Kate Bishop and Shuri and all those kind of characters.
Very well said, Dave. Yeah, I mean, like you guys, I think this is another fun addition to the MCU. I really loved where this went. I had a great time. And like, I actually appreciated it and enjoyed it more the second time. So I'm kind of I feel as if this is a film that with rewatchers, you'll find new little things to really appreciate and explore more within this film. And, I really appreciate as well the direction from Kate Shortland. I thought she did a wonderful job. She deserves a lot of credit for the look of the film, the pacing of the film. I thought it flew by, really well done. What she was able to get out of the performers. And, it can't help at times to be a little formulaic. It doesn't try too hard to do anything too new. But I can get over that from, like I said, the wonderful performances from everyone and all the fun action. So, yeah, looking forward to see where they go next with Yelena and the other characters, but I'm sure we'll find out very, very soon. So let's get on out of here then. Kelly, thank you so, so much for coming on the show. We really appreciate you coming on board and giving your opinion on this film. It was fun to have you.
Yeah, it's been a wonderful time. Thank you for having me.
No problem. And for our listeners out there, would you be able to tell them where they can find you on the socials and what you're getting up to?
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm a writer on Fresh Take Hub. I'm also super active over on Twitter. I'm at Kelly Lou Bishop, as in Louise, talking a lot about Suicide Squad at the minute. I'm very excited for that one. So we'll see where that one goes. But yeah, that's where I'm most active over there.
I was going to say Kelly's in my comic book good books because she's excited for Suicide Squad.
How about yourself, Dave? Are you also ramping up for Suicide Squad? I know you are.
Yes, as well as like also just getting off the high of Richard E. Grant as classic Loki. You can catch me over on Twitter at David Osgar, Osgar. You can catch me on Letterboxd, same name. Where as I watch the new releases in the cinema, you can see my sort of thoughts on those, why I rate everything. And you can also catch me on freshtakehub.com as well. I recently had a feature go up about the epic movies, which, like I said, some of them are good examples maybe of female characters, others probably not so much because they stick very much to the tropes of the damsel and all that kind of stuff. So you can kind of see how we've evolved now to films like Black Widow through some of those and films we'll have in the future. So go check that out, all about the epic films. So, yeah.
Awesome stuff. Yeah, and likewise, you can also find me on Twitter at SweatyJake, and you can also catch me on Letterboxd at Jake Hart. That's HRT. Catch all my hot film takes and all my reviews. And as for the show, we're also on Twitter at Capes, Cows, and Masks, and you can also find us on Facebook. And whether you use Anchor, Spotify, Google, Apple, TuneIn, whatever you use to listen to us, please subscribe and follow us on there. And if you're on Apple, please leave us a rating and a review, as it all helps us go up in the rankings. So thank you all for listening. We'll see you all very soon. Stay safe, everyone. Goodbye.
Bye.